Hello, I want to talk about why the menopause is so much more than just hormonal change. It's an important life cycle and it's influenced by the cycles that went before and will influence the cycles that went ahead. So why do some women sail through the menopause while others find it that their body's on fire and it's a really difficult and challenging time? For some women it feels like a liberation, and for other women it just feels a bit like a nightmare. And also, why do artificial hormones, synthetic hormones, work well for some women, and for other women they really don't get on with them, and other women don't even need them at all? This is because it's so much more than just hormonal changes. It's an important life cycle, and it's influenced by the life that we've led up until this point. And some people do talk about the menopause as a second spring, but what does that actually mean, really? Hormones are part of an intricate network in our body. This intricate network is related to our brain. It is related to our reproductive organs, which I like to call palaces, inspired by Chinese medicine. It's related to our whole nervous system and our adrenal system, levels of stress in our bodies. Essentially, how we've lived our lives, how we live our lives, will influence how we experience the menopause. And today I want to look at these life cycles and what the second spring means. So I've actually created a chart that you can see, and our life cycles actually begin, in fact, with our conception. So our genetics, our DNA. We do know that in some families, in some cultures, in some ethnicities, there are much lower levels of, there's not even sometimes a word for menopause discomfort. Women don't have any issues. Whereas in other family lines, women do have issues. So there is an aspect that is related to our genetics. And we know now that our genetics are not determining what's going to happen in our life. Yes, they're important, but they're always modified by our environment. So how we live from day to day and our environment means everything, really. It's our first environment, and going back to life cycles, our first environment after conception is our mother's womb. And so our experience of the 9 months in her womb, which is really when we're immersed in her experiences, has a very profound influence, because already our DNA is programmed a lot in our womb. If our mother was under constant stress, or if our mother was in a happy situation, intermittent stress is fine, but if a mother's in a violent relationship or is suffering trauma, or she was hiding the pregnancy wasn't planned, all of this will influence us. If she was depressed or if she was happy, also the foods that she eats, that's the core of the cycles of life. And then how we were born. I've got a whole series of videos on how our birth imprints on us now. Actually, before I go too much further, I want to say that none of this is predetermined either. Although these are important early life phases, we can always change by what we do in our life. The DNA isn't destiny. Yes, it does create a framework, but we can always change and transform. But yes, our early life, it's important to understand what happened, because then we have more tools. We know that there are things that we need to transform. And so our birth imprints, and again, our first years, our early years, are going to imprint us the life that we lived after birth. The food that we ate is very important. Our emotional well-being and security. Did we feel safe? Were our parents happy to have us? Were they happy with each other? Was there a lot of violence or stress or arguments? Were our needs met as much as is possible? Obviously, not all of our needs can be met, but were our needs met appropriately? Were we listened to? All of this has a profound influence on us. And that's an important cycle of our life, our childhood. In this chart, it's actually also based on Chinese medicine. And some of you might think, oh, Chinese medicine, that's a bit, how's that relevant now? But it's interesting. They talked about cycles of life, and cycles, they talked about the importance of the womb, they talked about the imprinting of birth. But after birth, they talk about cycles of 7 years for women and 8 years for men. And if we now look at the chart, then we see after the first cycle, we're 7 or 8. They're not so fixed. It doesn't mean everything suddenly changes when we're 7 or when we're 8, but it's like a cycle, like a daily cycle or an annual cycle or a seasonal cycle, which I will come to. But this 7-year cycle is considered important because the first 7 years for girls or 8 years for boys, we're still a child. Okay, maybe that's changing now because of exposure of children to lots of things that are maybe not so relevant for a child, but still it's a time when everything's new. And in ancient China, they said that's a time of playfulness. Hopefully it's of innocent, again, sadly not for everybody, but it's a time when we're really getting to know the world and we're exploring, we're open, we're adaptable, we're flexible, we're in awe. And if we are allowed to explore the world in the way that feels appropriate for us, then that's important and that will set the scene for future things. Whereas if we're under a lot of stress, that's going to have an influence. And then in the second cycle or within the second cycle, so by the end of the second cycle, we're 14. Girls are 14. I'm talking more about the menopause. For boys, puberty is later. We will have had probably our first period when the average age now is about 12. That has changed. In traditional cultures, even until the 19th century, most girls wouldn't have their first period until they were about 16 or 17. So actually the beginning of the third cycle. But you can see what I mean about the cycles. Don't be too rigid about 7 years, but it does mirror, in fact, hormonal changes. So the Chinese didn't know about the hormones in the way that we now do. They weren't able to break them down and talk about estrogen and progesterone, but they knew that something shifted. Our body is changing, and the changes are related to our brain and changes in our reproductive organs, our palaces, changes in our bones, in our body. And we're growing. And then if you see in the next cycle, we're moving into our adult self. Of course, it changes very physically and emotionally, but we're growing, we're becoming more stable. In the first 7 years, there's a lot of change within our body. Also in the second and the third cycles, 14 to 21 for girls, we're still growing, we're still developing. And this is considered to be the springtime of our life, like a plant pushing up through the earth. It's quite an energetic phase of our life. In Chinese medicine, they talk about that being yang, the more active, the more outward, daytime activity. As we know, younger children run around a lot. They always seem to have a lot more energy than adults. Gradually, as we settle into our third cycle, so for girls or young women, that's from 14 to 21. And again, during our first periods, we're continuing to be influenced by the outer world. Well, all through our life, we can change what we eat. We can change the emotional situations in. Hopefully, we can change to be in situations where there's less stress rather than more stress. A small amount of stress is part of life. But if it's constant, ongoing stress, that's not so good. Anyway, we're still in the springtime, and then as we come more into the next cycle, 21, 28, or even 35, we could see this plant, who is us, is maturing and becoming more fruitful. We might have fruits. We might see that our fruits are children. It's our fertile time and the summertime. And we now know from Western point of view that peak fertility is probably in these cycles of 21 to 28 and 28 to 35. And then after that, our fertility declines, but it's all relative. From 35 to 42, many women continue to have children and be fertile. And from 42 to 49 also. It really shows how what's going on in our body is determined by our genetics and our lifestyle and how we've lived our life. But we can say by the time we reach 49, 7 cycles, for many women, the fertility has gone. In the 42 to 49 year cycle, our fertility is declining more strongly. The number of eggs that we have is declining. And then there is a point at which, when the menopause, our periods stop. So it fits in with these 7-year cycles. So the Chinese would say this is a time then of a redirection of energy. The energy that we used from our first period to our last period was an expression of our body that has the power to not only conceive children, but also to look after them during 9 months of pregnancy, and also traditionally to feed them with our own body for at least another year, maybe 2, maybe 3 years. So it's a big ask for a female body. And there's a certain phase in our life around about 49 where actually we need this energy for ourselves. And so that's actually how the ancient Chinese would describe the menopause, that the energy, at a certain age, we have enough energy that we can give some potentially to have a baby, to nourish another physical life, another being. But at some point, we need this energy for ourselves. So there's a redirection of energy, of our being. I mean, what is energy? It's our whole being. It's what we eat, it's how we breathe, it's how our body is made. That's what I talk about. I'm talking about energy in its broadest sense at this point. And then we need to change, because after 50, we need to have all this energy that's used in our body for ovulation, for menstruation, but also potentially for nourishing a baby. We need this for ourselves to nourish us in our second half of life. So again, with the seasons, I think that's really important, because some people think that for women, after you can't have children anymore, you're no longer useful in society. But we know that that's not true. Women in many cultures have lived to be even 100 years. Even today, some women live to be 100 years. So it's only halfway through our life. And women can do some of their most creative things in the second half of their lives. And so this is where we get the seasons. I've talked about the earlier seasons of our life, the spring as a child, going into adulthood, and then becoming more mature and being in our peak fertility. That's the summer of our life. And then our fertility starts to decline. So there's a gradual shift. If you see us like a plant, this is where the idea of the seasons come from. At some point, we go more into a mature phase. We release our crop, or we release our fertility, and we're going more into an autumn, and it's a slowing down phase. It's a more inward phase, a gathering in phase. I'm actually making this video at the end of summer, going into autumn, and it's a returning back to the source. And in the chart, you'll see I have this autumn of harvesting. Then we're going back eventually into a winter, a slowing down, a re-evaluation, a resetting phase, which is a quieter time. In a way, you could almost say that it's going back to the womb, because if you look at the beginning of the chart, we're in water after conception. I mean, even before we're surrounded by the amniotic sac, we're cells which are differentiating in water. We're in a fluid environment until we're born, and then we come to the earth. And this fluid environment is associated more with the winter phase because it's more moist, it's more damp, and it's also more yin, a going inwards, a nighttime, a rest. That doesn't mean we rest all the time. It means that we need perhaps to take time to reflect on our life so far, to not be quite so active. It's all relative. We can still have active days, like in the winter, we can have days when we feel full of energy, and other days we just want to be a bit slower. But it's the first winter of our lives. So we go within, we slow down. It's a time for inner work. And a lot of people talk these days about women doing inner work, reevaluating our priorities, coming to a sense of where we are in our life. I talked about pregnancy and birth, but not all women have children. They still go through the same cycles of fertility and an ending of fertility. If women had wanted children and didn't have children, then there can be grieving for the children they didn't have. That's also associated with the autumn time, a letting go, a going back into the winter, going back to the source. So we let go, that like the trees in the autumn are letting go of their leaves. There's a grieving, there's a starkness. And why do some women experience this why do women experience this in different ways? Because we all grieve differently. And for some, the letting go can be a relief. I no longer need to worry about contraception or unwanted children. For other women, if they'd wanted children and didn't have children, then this can be a time of grieving, of acceptance for what was not possible. Even if women hadn't wanted children, it's a grieving for the end of a cycle of life. So it's the seasons of life. And some women are more naturally at home in that phase of going inwards, being quieter, being more introspective, and other women are not. And also how we are in this phase of resetting. So I put rest and reset. Some of us have more things to reset than others. Have we been looking after ourselves in this first phase of life? Have we been getting enough rest? Have we been eating nourishing food? Have we been surrounded by nourishing relationships? Or have we had to fight a lot? Are we having to really establish who we are? Are we in a fairly competitive workplace environment? Have we not been that supported in our relationships? And this is why actually many women in the perimenopause, so the phase leading up to the end of the cycle, which I include really with the autumn phase. With autumn is letting go. So it might be letting go of relationships which no longer serve us. It might be changing career. A lot of women halfway through their life change career if they have that possibility. A letting go, it's time to maybe moving, lots of things, but it's that autumn letting go, reevaluating, so that then hopefully we can have time to recharge. And I think a reason that there are many reasons why women have different symptoms in the menopause, but it's also that some women arrive in this time of resetting in autumn and they're already quite exhausted. So they need even more rest. And because they're exhausted, they need more support. And because they're exhausted, it's more difficult potentially for the body to readjust. They're running on empty. And I find this a lot with women, either who've had children or not had children, that often women are doing a lot more these days than they used to. They're working inside the home, often looking after the house, whether or not they have children, but also going out to work and often in quite stressful, competitive jobs. And so their energy is quite exhausted when they come, and they need much more of this rest. And resting isn't so valued in our society. That time of winter, of emptiness, of just feeling maybe a bit flat, feeling less creative. But if we can embrace this winter time, and the autumn that leads up to it, letting go, re-evaluating, and really nourish ourselves, there will be a second spring. So this is the second spring I talked at the beginning, that it's almost like we go back into the womb in a way, energetically. And it can be time when we do this inner work that we question our relationship with our mother, we maybe change our relationship with our mother, we do work on ourselves in whatever kind of way that can be. I'll talk a bit about that at the end. And then resetting, we then not going to stay in the winter for the rest of our lives. We emerge into a second spring, and we can rediscover this playful child of our first spring, especially if we weren't able to be a playful child in our first spring. We can now be freer, and we can feel, let's just explore what I want to do. And an image I quite like of this season is, and also the winter, is we're going in a watery space to become the baby, to connect with our young baby, our inner child, whatever you want to call it, and nourish ourselves and begin to put ourselves again at the center of our life, to have an opportunity to mother ourselves in the way that we would have liked to have been mothered, to support ourselves. Now we can choose, hopefully. Obviously, I'm aware that not everyone has lots of choices, but we can always choose. It doesn't have to cost lots of money. We can decide that we're going to take charge and we're going to live our life in the rhythm that we want. And then we can be this playful child and try new things and explore and see the world anew with the wisdom that we've gained from all the first season cycles. And so we can re-explore the spring in a new way, be playful, be creative. Many women I know have some of their most creative times in this second phase of our life. And the second seasons are not so tied to physical changes in our body in the same kind of way that the first round of seasons are. You'll see that the years between men and women change quite a lot, and there aren't definite hormonal changes for men in the same kind of way as women. But see the second half of the cycle ages, it's just to give an idea. Because, of course, not everybody, especially these days, lives to be 100 or more. So it might not be halfway through our life. Like I said, the cycles of 7 and 8, it's not so fixed. It's just to give an idea that, maybe for, depending on how long we live, we experience a second spring and we have more creativity. We might move house. You might change relationships, have a new home, have new excitement, travel a lot, have creative projects. And then those new things of the spring will then turn into this summer. And we'll have a second summer of fruiting, of different projects. For many women, that may include having even the first season, second season, the spring and the summer may include having grandchildren, or their friends having grandchildren, or being connected again with that energy very directly through having contact with young children. And I think that can be quite important. It's especially important for women that don't have children or don't have grandchildren. Being with young children helps us to connect with those energies and helps re-evoke those feelings in us. And maybe we can give to the children in our lives. They might be our nieces, our nephews, they might be friends' children. But I would recommend in your older years to spend time with children, because they do see life anew. They're very playful and they can help us to connect with our inner child. And then as they grow and they move into their summer and we move into our second summer, again, there can be different fruits in this second summer. And it's not so tied to 7-year cycles and the 7-year cycles, but it just passes through in our own rhythms. That's how I see the second cycles in a way. It's we're creating now our own spring in our own time, and our own summer in our own time, and our own autumn of gathering in. And then eventually we go back into our second winter, which is the end of our life. And again, that's not a 7-year cycle. I've just kept the things in the chart to give that idea. 7 years but not necessarily, of course. But it's just going back into that winter, the final slowing down at the end of our life, when we do use our body much less physically, but maybe we've been able to take all the lessons of our life so far and accept our final ending, accept our final breath, and accept to leave our bodies finally in peace. And so I've taken you on a little journey through your life, and I just coming back to the actual menopause and hormones, the starting point for the talk. I'm now going to show the cycle of hormones in our life. And I think it's really interesting because before puberty, our hormones, because people often talk about menopause as we're hormone deficient. And I always like to look at, well, what's the body actually naturally doing? And there must be a reason for this. So hormone deficiency, is this a thing? Because actually before we start our menstrual cycle, our levels of estrogen, progesterone and progesterone, estrogen and testosterone even, are low. And then through our menstrual years, they rise. In puberty, they rise. In this chart, I haven't put all the changes during the menstrual cycle because it obviously varies each month, but just that there's an initial adjustment phase. So that's also why puberty is not so different in some ways to the menopause, to the perimenopause. And some of the symptoms of puberty, like hot flashes or like fainting or like not being able to sleep, actually, when I think about it, so it might be worth you also reflecting on the previous cycles of your life and how they might be influencing the current cycles of your life. So how was your puberty and how does that relate to your menopause? Because puberty can be a time of blushing, of hot flushes, of fainting, of not being able to sleep, and many things that are not so dissimilar to the perimenopause. And the brain is going through huge amounts of changes. So all of that's going on in puberty. And you can see that reflected. The hormones are trying to adjust to becoming higher levels, and our body is changing to support the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, etc. And then as we're in the perimenopause, it's a similar thing, but in the other way. I mean, it's not completely the same, but you can see it's sort of a bit all over the place. But then it settles gradually into lower levels. And so we can say that the menopause or the perimenopause, the whole phase, is a recalibration of our energies. Now, does this mean it's a deficiency? If that's what the body is naturally doing, I would say no. And women, artificial hormones, synthetic hormones, are relatively new, and women lived for many years well and healthily in many communities in the world. So that's interesting that that's mirrored in our hormones, and then we're just more settled. So actually that fits in with the cycles, the seasons of life, that spring and then spring, the second spring, we're having hormones more or less how they were in our first spring. And so to finish, I want to say that there's lots that we can do to support ourselves through these times. And I work a lot with some vessels or meridians, channels of Chinese medicine called the extraordinary vessels, which regulate these connections between our brain and our reproductive organs, which I call the palaces, and our heart, and our kidneys. For the Chinese, the adrenal glands were part of the kidneys. So as I said earlier, they didn't understand what hormones were, but they knew how to work with them. And so I'd like to finish with connecting with these organs that are so connected with the changes that are going on indeed throughout our lives, and that we can change. We can always transform, whatever our first seasons are like. The second seasons are an opportunity to transform, and so I have created an affirmation. I embrace my second spring, second summer, second autumn, and second winter as new phases of learning and wisdom. And during these second seasons, I find new expressions for my creativity, with acknowledging that perhaps the strength of my physical body is waning, but my capacity to direct my energies is increasing. And so I'd like you to just spend a couple of minutes with me, maybe just letting all this settle in your body, perhaps closing your eyes, perhaps placing a hand on your heart and over your pubic bone to connect with your palace of creativity. Our womb is not just the place to create a new physical life in the form of a baby, but also it is our creative center for any creative projects, for any changes, where we will create and have fruits and then eventually let go. So as you might want to close your eyes, feel your heart beating, have a hand over your palace of creativity. You could support your lower back and just breathe into feeling where you are in your journey through the cycle of the seasons of your life. And I hope that you enjoyed seeing your life as seasons. And if there's anything that you're not clear about, I'd really love you to ask me, because I find that Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, is such an amazing way of understanding our bodies. But I'm aware that not everyone knows that much about it. So please let me know if there are any ways that I can express it better. Thank you for sharing this time with me.